Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here for our next DCUSH mini lesson, and today we are going to be looking at the Tariff of Abominations and really the revenge of Andrew Jackson since that corrupt bargain that happened the last time we met. So here's what we're going to be looking at in this mini lesson. We're going to be summarizing the events of the Tariff of 1828, and then also looking at the Nullification crisis that comes along with that, and explaining why all of this is significant, kind of why we're picking on this story in particular, while we're talking about all of Jacksonian America. So, what we're going to be looking at here, our essential questions, is kind of one of our big focus points is where does the actual power in the United States come from? Is it from the states or the federal government? And this again is kind of a big question that's early on that's repeated throughout U.S. history, is like, who should be in charge, the states or the federal government? And then also we're going to look at how does Andrew Jackson actually wield this political power that he's going to be given once he does become president, because even though Jackson is a Southerner, you'll see that he has a very kind of particular attitude towards states and states' rights. Okay, so let's go ahead and remind ourselves where we had kind of left off. Okay, so John Quincy Adams for the last 4 years has been president, and that was again from what Andrew Jackson had called the corrupt bargain, where John Quincy Adams had become president, but then the votes that he got from Henry Clay, he had given Henry Clay that position as Secretary of State. Okay, so what's been happening basically over this 4 years is that Martin Van Buren has been helping Jackson really turn the kind of mechanism and the party that Jackson had started creating in 1824 into a national powerhouse, and that is the Democrat Party. Jackson again is kind of going to run in 1828 like he did in 1824 on kind of this like self-made man rising up from kind of poor common origins, kind of like this kind of fighting background. And he's also popular everywhere. This is mostly because Jackson at this time kind of takes a very kind of like middle stance on things, especially the tariff. So in the South, people in the South like him because he calls for a judicious tariff, one that's kind of fair, but not, too high or too low. And this makes people in the North happy because they like tariffs, they want them to be there, so that way it can protect their industry. And then people in the South like this too because they agree that tariffs are somewhat necessary, but they don't want them to be too high. And so really what we see here is that Jackson's trying to kind of set himself up to be successful in 1828 when that election rolls around. And what he's going to focus on, and this will kind of come into play here in a few slides, is really two big things, and that is rotation and decentralization. Okay, so what we mean by rotation is he's going to get rid of the people when he does get elected, excuse me, of rotating the people out of office who are not loyal to him. Okay, and this kind of goes back to what we talked about before with the spoils system, that he wants to have people in office who are loyal to him. And then later, with decentralization, he's really going to be focusing on, and you'll definitely see this here in the Tariff of 1828, and then also in the national bank debate, which we will get into later activities, that he's wanting to really kind of, as much as possible, kind of slow down these national kind of improvement projects and put some of this power back into state and local hands. This isn't at all saying that he doesn't think that the national government should be in charge. As you'll soon see, he definitely will believe that once he becomes president. But it's the idea that he wants to at least get rid of some of these powers that he feels that are abusive at a national level. Okay, and you'll definitely again see that with the bank conflict, and then also a few other things that he does during his presidency. Okay, but let's talk about how he actually does become president and this tariff conflict that happens. Okay, so again, let's remind ourselves we're using this word, a tariff. What is a tariff? Well, when the election of 1828 rolls around, it is a election mostly built on this tariff that is being proposed, and that is the Tariff of 1828, also called later the Tariff of Abominations. Okay, and why this is such a big deal is this tariff, which again, tariff is a tax on imported goods. It is quite something, okay? And this is it's called this name because it proposed a tax on imported goods up to 50%. Okay, which is incredibly, incredibly high. That basically means, for example, like if you were to go and buy gas today for like, let's say $3 a gallon, that gas would actually cost you $4.50. Okay, so it's a gigantic tax. And normally we know from studying tariffs and thinking about industry, the North would be completely in favor of this. But this time around, you'll see that it's a little bit more complicated. Okay, so what's going to happen here? So, well, Jackson starts out, okay, that when Jackson, okay, again, Jackson is still he's still in the Congress. He's still, participating in the national, kind of things, or the national debate of things. Jackson starts devising a strategy, and what he's going to do is he's not only going to have this tariff in place, which the North would be in favor of, okay, but he uses his influence in Congress to get Democrats to include on this tariff bill a tax that would also tax raw materials. So not only would this tariff hurt the South now, it's also going to hurt the North, because being an industrializing kind of, region of the country, it's also going to hurt them. So this tariff of abominations, Jackson thinks, is going to become unpopular both in the North and in the South. Okay, and you're like, why the heck is Jackson doing this? Well, he's got a plan in mind. And Jackson, being a Democrat, and Democrats mostly being people in the South not in favor of tariffs anyways, he's got something devious that he's got planned. Okay, and so I'm going to skip ahead of this question, but here's his scheme. Okay, he's going to make the tariff so unpopular that both the North and the South will look at this and be like, oh God, like, no, we're never going to go for this. And Jackson will stand up, and having kind of manipulated things into the background to make this tariff so unpopular, he's going to stand up and, against this tariff, and he's going to look like a hero, that he's standing up for both the North and the South against this awful tariff that's been proposed, even though he's been the one that's kind of been pushing it forwards. However, this scheme sort of backfires. And why is because the North, even though there's a tax on raw materials, still goes for the tariff, and Congress passes it. And this was not Jackson's plan at all. Okay, the North actually says, they kind of make a bet here, that they're like, okay, well, there's a tax on raw materials, but we can survive that in the short term, and then we'll get it fixed later. And so the North is like, okay, we'll go for the tariff for now, and Congress passes it, and Jackson was not expecting that. Now, the thing why this is actually kind of a good thing is because all the blame for this tariff goes on the current president, who is John Quincy Adams, who's in office until January, and he loses re-election. Not completely, due to this tariff, but in part. And so this tariff is now on the books. Okay, like when Jackson becomes president, he basically is now forced to be a part of this tariff and that kind of economy that he kind of helped create. And now he's got a problem on his hands, because even though now this tariff is in place, Jackson's a Democrat. The South is now part of this 50% tax, and they do not like it at all. Okay, and the South absolutely starts screaming at Jackson to do something about it. And what happens is that one state in particular, South Carolina, looks at this tariff, and they tell Jackson, do something about it or there's going to be a problem. And the North actually does help revise a lower tariff that gets passed in 1832, but South Carolina brings together a convention of delegates, and they threaten to nullify, basically, this law. And if you remember nullification, this was a thing that was proposed all the way back by Thomas Jefferson and Madison in that Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And Jackson is now in a really, really bad spot because he's president, and you have a state that is threatening his authority as a kind of as the chief executive, even though he's not a fan of the tariff either, you know, being a Southerner. And so this puts Jackson now in a real bit of a predicament. And so South Carolina. Now we've got a problem, and this is 1832. This is basically 30 years before the Civil War is going to break out, and we have a state that is threatening to nullify a national law. And what South Carolina does is not only do they threaten to nullify the law, okay, but they have a pamphlet that gets anonymously published, and it's ghostwritten by the actual sitting vice president of the United States, who was at that time John Calhoun. Remember, Calhoun had helped support Jackson in his run to be the president in 1824. And Calhoun, by this time, has started to take a complete shift away from being a Southerner who was in favor of a big national government still being in charge. He's starting to become a states' rights guy, and he will continue to keep going down that route. And this pamphlet that he writes, it's called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. It's got a nice long title. Basically says, it's kind of like an exact repeat of what's in that Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And South Carolina then goes forward, nullifies the law, and then threatens secession if that 1832 tariff is enforced. They threaten to leave the Union. And again, like, this is a lower tariff than what was there in 1828, and now Jackson's got a serious problem. He's got a state that is threatening to leave the Union if this tariff is not gotten rid of, and this is going to be quite an issue. Okay, so what is Jackson's solution? Well, it's to both go at it with force, but then also to try to kind of relax that tariff of abominations that's on the book. So again, Jackson understands the South, but as president, he has to enforce federal supremacy, or he'll lose kind of the power that he has as a president. So he does strike a balance. He passes what is called the Force Bill. Okay, and basically what this says is Congress can use military force to crack down on a state and enforce the collection of taxes, a tariff. And if you think about this, this is basically, if we go back like 40 or 50 years, this is exactly why the United States or the colonies had seceded from Great Britain, because Great Britain said that it could, by military force, collect taxes, and the colonies were not in favor of this. So this, again, this doesn't make Jackson look great, but at the same time, Jackson tries to relax things. He passes a new tariff act that by 1842, okay, so that's about a 10-year period, it will drop the tariff back down to what was there even before the Tariff of Abominations. Technically, it's a tariff that was passed in 1816. So it will kind of, basically Jackson's saying like, okay, you know what, the federal government can absolutely collect taxes and will do so through military force, but at the same time, we'll bring that tariff down over time. So it's kind of a balanced approach. And you can watch that video there to kind of also summarize that. Okay, and indeed, South Carolina does back down from a threatened federal invasion of its state, and they do not secede from the Union yet. But why should we care about this event happening? Well, this is a really, really good example that we have of a state threatening, kind of challenging this notion that the federal government should be in charge of the states, that the federal government's superior. And then it's also a really good instance that we have of an early example of North-South conflict. And we can see how important here tariffs are. I mean, you have a state that is threatening to secede from the Union over a 50% tax. Okay. Also, this does not make Jackson look very good. Okay, so when in 1832 this happens, the idea that Jackson is threatening military force on a state to collect taxes makes him look like a dictator. And this, as you'll see here in a second, will help form the Whig Party, which will be the kind of, I guess, technically the third American political party that will come along. So let's actually go ahead and let's talk about the Whig Party. We can include that in here. Okay, it is basically an anti-Jackson party. Okay, they are not a huge fan of Jackson whatsoever. And in fact, I'm going to kind of combine two lessons here, which is totally okay. There's also a whole bunch of events in our next mini lesson that I'd love to go and talk more about, but I think there's enough explanation in here that should help you. Okay, there's other things in the Jackson administration that are in this next lesson, but for now, let's go ahead and talk about the Whigs, since this mini lesson is so short. Okay, so who are the Whigs? They are basically a political party that's kind of a remnant of the Federalists, but then also kind of a hybrid of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. They're basically an anti-Jackson party is the simple way to look at them. They're opposed to a strong executive. They look at themselves as defenders of liberty. They, just like the Federalists, loosely interpret the Constitution. They like tariffs. But they also kind of as this kind of standing up to tyranny are kind of adopting some of the ideas of the Democratic Republicans. Okay, so two of their most notable members will be the man who we heard about just earlier, Henry Clay, this guy right here, and then also a very notable Senator Daniel Webster. Okay, but if you want to know what happens to the Whig Party, the Whig Party being a national party, just like the Democrats are at this time, they're both in the North and in the South. When the Civil War comes along, you have Whigs that are in favor of slavery, continuing slavery, and you also have Whigs that are in favor of getting rid of slavery, and they're called conscience Whigs. But this slave question, when the Civil War comes around, it will completely split the party and it will destroy it. And many of their members, like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, will just simply get old and die. And they, once kind of those central figures of the Whig Party are gone, it just kind of dissolves. So there are, though that being said, there were many, many notable Whig presidents. Okay, William Henry Harrison from Indiana, John Tyler, not a super knowable guy, Zachary Taylor, and then also the president who nobody knows, Millard Fillmore. Okay, but all of these four gentlemen who were Whig presidents kind of represent this kind of reaction to Jackson during this time period. Okay, so other than that, that's pretty much it for the introduction to the Tariff of 1828 and kind of the Nullification crisis, and then also we went ahead and added on the Whigs to this. So, until next time, I will see you guys later for our next mini lesson. Bye-bye.